Welcome to Tuesday Horror Tales. I am your host, Dutta. Tonight, I will share with you a story entitled The Yellow-Legged Man by Sudhir Thapliyal. It was one of those early spring days in the mountains. Brilliant sunshine, blue skies, and the terraced fields golden with ripening mustard. A light wind rocked the wheat crop, and Bhavan Singh of the Garhwal Rifles knew he was home. Far away from the battlefields of France, where the trenches stank of death and putrefaction, and where the sun never came out of the fog of cordite and mustard gas. The year was 1918. Garhwal, in the central Himalayas, was thousands of miles from France. But for Bhavan Singh, it seemed as if he had left home only a few days ago. He had been gone more than 3 years, and in those days, news from home was scarce. Now, as he strode along the winding, narrow path that was to take him to his village, all he could think of was home food. His mouth watered at the thought of eating his mother's brown millet rotis of mustard leaves cooked in rich dollops of homemade butter, and the halwa, fine flour fried in butter and sweetened with jaggery, and then to wash it all down, fresh buttermilk. It had been a long trek from the railhead at Kotwar. This was his second day on the road. He had hoped to make it to his village by sundown, but now he had to take shelter under a huge oak as a sudden storm darkened the skies and hail beat about him wildly. In his knapsack, he had some tinned food, but he'd had enough of it in the trenches. So, while he waited out the storm, he kept thinking of his mother's cooking. Bhavan Singh also thought about the war, the foolishness of it all. He had joined the army because it was supposed to be his duty and a matter of honor. His father had served the same regiment. When the war broke out in some place he had never heard of, his father said he had to go and help his British masters. In his remote mountain village, Bhavan Singh had never seen a white man. But he got to know them quite well in the trenches. They were just like him, cannon fodder, they used to call themselves. The storm died down as suddenly as it had started. He heaved his pack onto his back and set off. Soon the birds could be heard, and the sound of the thrush brought a song to his lips. It has been a long time since he had sung, and the first notes didn't ring true. And then, somewhere along the path, he realized that something was wrong. Something was missing. He stopped, looked around. He was a few minutes from his uncle's village. But there was no one bringing the cows and goats home for the night. No smoke from the fireplaces. It was like approaching a village in Verdun, destroyed and abandoned because of the war. The houses were there as he remembered them, but what surprised him was that the village dogs were not barking. He walked into the silent, empty village, his boots dragging him to his uncle's house, where the door stood ajar. He walked in, and everything looked as it always had, except that there was nobody about. Had the whole family gone to work in the fields? But that he reminded himself was not possible, as his grandfather never left the house. He was too old to work in the fields, and all he could do was look after the babies. However, there were no babies and no grandpa. What he didn't know was that a bigger scourge than war had swept the Garhwal Himalayas that year. And that was the bubonic plague. Village after village had been totally destroyed of all living things, and the green and yellow mustard fields he saw around him were there because they had been planted before the plague. They were now ready for the harvesting, but there was no one to do the work. Those who had survived had abandoned their mountain homes and fled to the plains. As night fell, he stood in the courtyard, wondering what he should do. His own village was just beyond the ridge, and he set off for it, hoping all would be well there. As he rounded the path on the ridge, he looked down to his village, and it seemed as empty and forlorn as his uncle's. There were no lights and no activity. As he remembered it, there should be the sounds of children laughing or crying, people calling in their cows to be locked up for the night, and the occasional barking of dogs as they settled down for the nightly vigil against marauding leopards. Yet there was no sound and no light. The wind had picked up a bit, and as it raced down the mountainside, it sighed and moaned. It was still early for the moon to come up, and so it was totally dark as Bhavan Singh felt his way home. It was a path he had known ever since he could walk, but even then it seemed a bit unfamiliar to him. On the outskirts was the home of Bethalu, the outcast. As was the custom in those days, all outcasts had to live a little distance away from the main village. The main path passed above Bethalu's broken down shack. In the rains, the roof leaked because Bethalu never had any money for new slate tiles. In the winter, the snow went right down and through the roof. And in the summers, you couldn't sleep inside because of the flies and the heat. Looking down at it, Bhavan Singh saw a narrow crack of light. Aha, he said to himself, somebody is around. So he turned back and took the lower path leading to Bethalu's house. The light was a beacon of hope, a sign of some kind of life. As he stood before the low, narrow door leading to the shack, Bhavan Singh wondered who could be inside. He called out for Bethalu, and a voice from inside asked him to enter. He had to take off his knapsack because the doorway was too narrow, and he left it outside. As he stooped and walked in, he could just make out the figure of a man sitting near a wick lamp. It gave out a faint yellow light, but after the darkness outside, it had a welcome warmth of its own. There was a peculiar smell about the room, but he didn't pay much attention to it. He wanted to know where his family and the other villagers had gone. "Where have the people gone?" the soldier asked. There was no reply from the figure, crouched in the darkness. Bhavan Singh repeated himself, but again there was no reply. "Who are you?" He pressed on. The figure stirred slightly and then, like someone who has not spoken for a long time and is not used to speaking much, said, "What? Is that you?" It was a hacksaw of a voice, and it set Bhavan Singh's teeth on the edge. He felt a shiver run down his spine and the hair on his back stand up. And then he recognized the smell in the room. It was the smell of death and putrefaction. "Speak up, man," he shouted, less in anger than in panic. "Don't be frightened," the figure said. "I am not frightened," retorted the soldier. Yes, but you are," the figure replied. At this, Bhavan Singh lunged at him, but all he grabbed was thin air. The figure had moved away, and suddenly from behind him he heard wild laughter that filled the room and the countryside. He spun around, but there was nothing to see. The young soldier had known fear, but that was of a different kind. Now he went cold all over. Then the lamp went out, and the shack was plunged into darkness. The soldier felt rooted to the spot. He wanted to get out of the shack, but his limbs wouldn't move. What finally got him out of this paralysis was the growing stench of death and decay. It filled the room, and he could hardly breathe. Unladen limbs, he rose to his feet, and head bent low, moved to the door. He only had a few feet to go, but it seemed as though he was running for miles. His breathing was labored and hard. His chest felt as though it was going to burst. A little later, he found himself flat on his back. Above him, the moon was rising over the ridge. He struggled to his feet and looked around. The shack stood there, in silent testimony. His knapsack was leaning against the wall where he had left it. He went to it and took out his canteen of water, but there was not a drop in it. Strange, he thought. He had filled it at a spring just before reaching the village, and hadn't touched it after that. "Thirsty, are you?" boomed a voice. His throat was so dry he couldn't say a word. Then suddenly, from out of the darkness, a hand reached out with a pitcher full of water. The moonlight bounced off the brass vessel, and the soldier grabbed it greedily. He drank his fill. Then he started to feel hungry. "Hungry, are you?" boomed the voice again. And this time the soldier didn't say a word. He had got over the initial shock and fright. He was now wondering what was happening to him. He looked into the gloom and saw nothing. All he could hear was the sound of somebody breathing heavily. Then the voice came again. "Want your mother's cooking?" Getting braver and bolder, the soldier said, "Who are you? And can you give me any food?" And the voice said, "Wait and see." In what seemed like a few minutes, there were piping hot mustard leaves cooked in dollops of homemade butter, hot brown rotis of millet, and halwa. And to wash it all down, fresh buttermilk. The soldier looked at the feast spread before him and could not resist reaching out for it. The voice said, "Eat heartily, my boy. Eat heartily." The soldier sensed a kind of menace behind the offer. By then he had realized that something terrible, something wrong was going on. He was no longer hungry. All he wanted was to get away from this frightening spot. He was wondering what to do next when he felt a cold, clammy hand on the nape of his neck. And the voice was urging him to eat before the food got cold. That was more than he could bear, and he bolted like a runaway horse. Into the field he ran, jumping down terrace to terrace, cutting a wild furrow through the knee-high mustard, and at his heels came the labored breathing of a man in pursuit. Then the voice, "You won't get far, my boy. I haven't eaten for days, and I don't like my dinner running away from me." That spurred the soldier to run as fast as he could. Chest heaving, legs pumping madly, he ran through the mustard fields and from time to time leapt from one terrace to another terrace. And all the time, the voice followed him. The soldier was now running out of steam, and as he ran, he looked around for some place to hide. Then he remembered something his father had told him when he was a child. "Remember, my son," the old man had said, When you're being chased by an evil spirit, a ghost or a witch, run into the nearest cowshed and grab a cow round its neck. These foul things are mortally afraid of the holy cow. They can never harm you then. The soldier recollected that there was a cowshed not too far from where he was. He changed direction and charged towards the shed. As he dived into it, he felt a steely grip on one of his ankles. With his last ounce of energy and driven by great fear, he jerked his foot free and fell on the neck of a cow. He hugged her with all his strength and prayed for deliverance from the evil outside. He was at bay and he knew it. The cow was his only lifeline. Outside he could hear the deep breathing of a man who has run far and hard. His own breathing was slowly returning to normal, but his heart was in his mouth. He also remembered his father telling him that these evil spirits ruled only at night, and that by dawn they were gone. He knew he had to hold on till daybreak. Outside the voice said, "That cow won't live long, my son, and when it dies, I'll come and eat you." The soldier felt for the thick vein running under the cow's neck. The pulse was irregular and faint. "Come on, mother cow," he prayed. "Don't let me down now." And he began massaging the animal in the hope that it might last out the night. Outside he could hear his pursuer pacing up and down like a soldier on sentry duty. Bhavan Singh did not know what the time was. All he knew was that he had to keep the cow alive till dawn. If she died, then it was his turn to go. So he worked hard at keeping the cow warm. He rubbed her with wads of straw till his arms ached, and he felt he could no longer go on. And then, in the faint light of dawn, he saw the gradually brightening outline of the door to the cowshed. Outside, a howling arose that echoed from hilltop to hilltop. It was a chilling sound, piercing through the soldier's very soul. He clapped his hands to his ears to shut off the sound, but he could feel it to his bones. Just like the times when he used to be under an artillery bombardment. Quiet returned so suddenly that it was almost painful. A crow cawed somewhere, and the cow fell limp in his arms. She had died. He disentangled himself and crawled out into the open, taking large gulps of the sweet mountain morning air. Bhavan Singh started to get his nerves and mind together. Was it a dream? A nightmare? No, it couldn't be. He looked at his leg wraps. They were stained yellow from running through the mustard fields. To further confirm his experience, he set off for Bethalu's shack. He stood by the doorway and saw that his pack was still leaning against the wall. He mustered all his courage and entered the dingy hut. Sunbeams streamed through the cracks in the roof. In one corner, he saw something laid out, covered in a white sheet. With the toe of his boot, he lifted the one corner of the sheet. It was a man, a dead man, and from the smell, it seemed he had been dead for some time. He lifted the sheet further until he had uncovered the whole body. It was totally naked, and the legs were stained yellow from running through the mustard fields. Folks, life throws at us the inexplicable, be it through art or in reality. I am your host, Prajna, signing off for the time being. Hope to see you all next week for another edition of the Tuesday Horror Tales. Stay safe, stay blessed, and just when you thought ghosts do not exist, you might just hear a small creak